Good evening and welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, Talk of the Stacks is a free author lecture series produced by Friends with guest authors who focus on the craft of writing, as well as urgent social, economic, and historical topics. Now, tonight we are honored to welcome the Pulitzer Prize winner, Stacy Schiff, author of the new biography, The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams, for our season finale. But first, on behalf of the library and Friends, we would like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. By offering this land acknowledgement, we commit to recognizing Indigenous nations and to holding ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. In fulfillment of this pledge, we commit to supporting Indigenous culture and building bridges of connection to our local Native American communities. Thank you. Well, I would next like to recognize our generous sponsors who help make this free series possible. Many thanks to the Star Tribune, LSE Architects, and Knorr Companies. Now, with the holiday season in full swing, we are once again at that time of year that celebrates joy, interconnectedness, and goodwill towards all. And this year, Hennepin County Library has an ample helping of all three. Now, with the spirit of giving in mind, we at Friends are hard at work adding 15,000 books to our library's collection by December 31st. And we are asking you, our library friends, to consider lending a helping hand. Your year-end donation could purchase that very first book a child checks out with their library card, or provide a weekly delivery of books and activities to a homebound patron, or fulfill your ebook craving during that next polar vortex. And here in Minnesota in December, we know there are surely a couple ahead of us. So if you would like to help us meet our goal, simply click on the link in the chat to donate. Thank you so much for your consideration. And finally, at the end of tonight's talk, we will be taking questions from all of you, our audience members. And you can log that question of yours at any time under the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So start thinking about what you'd like to ask our author. And now, here to introduce tonight's special guest is the talented Sue Campbell, Star Tribune Managing Editor of Features and Editorial Director of the Star Tribune magazine. Thank you so much for being with us, Sue, and I hope all of you enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Christy. That was such a nice welcome. And good evening to everyone out there, all the avid library patrons and all the big readers out there. The Star Tribune is always pleased to support the library since both of our organizations share goals of informing and entertaining all of you who are joining us from home. We're especially delighted to be part of Stacy Schiff's visit tonight, given how much she herself has illuminated some of the world's most compelling historical figures. But before I introduce tonight's special guest, let me first tell you about moderator Lori Herzl. Lori is the senior editor for books at the Star Tribune, where she has worked for more than 20 years. Besides being a wonderful critic and colleague, she's also an author. She's got 3 books under her belt, including News to Me, Adventures of an Accidental Journalist, which won a 2011 Minnesota Book Award. Lori has also served as a past president of the National Book Critics Circle. Now, our guest of honor, Stacy Schiff, is the celebrated author of 6 critically acclaimed biographies. Included in this list is Vera, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Saint-Exupéry, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, Cleopatra, winner of the Penn Award for Biography, and most recently, The Witches, Salem, 1692. This fall, Schiff added to her list of page-turning biographies with her latest, The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams, which critics have hailed as a delightfully enthralling and insightful account of an elusive founding father, a tour de force. It's my pleasure to welcome moderator Lori Herzl and guest of honor, Stacy Schiff. to Talk of the Stacks.
Hi, Stacy. Nice to see you. I think you're muted still.
Go.
Hello.
That works better. Hi, Sue. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Sue. Hi, Lori.
Hi. This is going to be fun. I wanted to ask you, first of all, so Sue just mentioned the biographies that you have written, and I was wondering, is there a common denominator here? Is there some theme that you're looking for when you choose your subjects? Is there one thing that you think is common to all of them?
It's just like you to start with the $1 million question. I don't have a unified theory of the continuity among the books personally. A couple of people have suggested things. I'm not sure they make sense to me.
Mhm.
I do think there's sometimes a reaction. One book leads to another book in a very direct way. The Cleopatra idea, for example, was an idea that I had before I wrote a book on Ben Franklin, because I had been toying with this question of when you put women in power together, why is that such a toxic combination? But I couldn't figure out how to do the book because I didn't feel I had the material with which to write a proper life. And then after I'd written the Franklin book, for which there is this massive amount of documentation, I was swimming in documentation for 5 years there. Then I suddenly thought, maybe it's possible. Maybe I was just hungering for something where there was less material. But I realized that in all that documentation for Franklin, you still can't answer basic questions about his life. So maybe I was a little more confident of going out on a limb with Cleopatra, thinking you can actually write at least around the holes in the life and come up with something like a continuous narrative. And out of Cleopatra fell the book about Salem witchcraft, because I really wanted to think more about women's voices and how they become, when we hear them, and how they become contorted by history. And that kind of led me directly back to 17th century Massachusetts.
Oh, interesting. I would not have seen a connection between Cleopatra and Samuel Adams, but yeah, very clear.
There is a bit of a connection with the witches as well, in the sense that I started in 2016 with Samuel Adams. And as I think many of us were in 2016, we were profoundly thinking about the origins of America and what the country stood for and how we had got where we were. And I had gone back to thinking about who was in my Franklin book and whom I might sort of pick up the story with. And in the back of my mind was this sort of thudding realization from the witches, which was that it was a year when it was immensely important for someone to have the courage of his convictions, and very dangerous for someone to do so. And who were those people who actually had the moral compass, had the moral fiber to be able to stand their ground? And that idea, which really fell out of 1692 in the witch trials, really led me directly to Samuel Adams.
Mm-hmm. I love this book, and everybody should buy it. It is really a fun read too. But I have to say, when I'm reading it, there are these bells going off from like grade school and junior high when I studied the American Revolutionary War, and the Stamp Act, and Shays Rebellion. I remember that. The name Samuel Adams did not really ring a very strong bell at all. And I'm wondering, is there a reason why he's missing from at least my education? And should we be more aware of him?
Yeah, I obviously am a little bit biased at this point. I think we should all be, very much aware of him. He disappears for really interesting reasons. In large part, post-revolution, you want to shuffle the revolutionaries off the stage. It's very important, obviously, for the new institutions to take over, and for the hotheads to kind of be escorted off stage. You don't want to talk about, the Boston Tea Party is the destruction of the tea. It's an act of vandalism long before it becomes a tea party. So it takes a while to come to terms with some of the disorder of those years. And no one is more present in that messy, anarchic street theater business in those sort of 10 to 12 years leading up to the revolution than is Adams. So to some extent, there is this kind of need to forget the less savory, less sanitized part of the picture. But he does himself no favors. John Adams at one point will say to him post-revolution, if you would just collect your papers from those 30 years, you could explain the American Revolution. Everyone in the world will want to read them. And Samuel Adams doesn't make a collection of his papers, and in fact destroys many of his papers. So there really is this there's this recessive, very modest part of his character, and there's no sort of preening for posterity, in contradistinction to his cousin John, who's very eager to be remembered by history and is always kind of competing against Washington and Franklin for the chief role in having been the great revolutionary.
There is a scene in the book when he's burning his notes, or I'm not sure what it is he's burning, he's destroying them. How did you find this out, and did it make you cry? Because I mean, here's all of this material like gone up the chimney that you certainly could have used.
You understand so well. Thank you for realizing that the biographer's heart cracks. In the diaries of John Adams, he leaves us this scene in which John and Samuel, who are very close and are working hand in glove, are sitting together in Samuel's rooms in Philadelphia. They're both at the Continental Congress at this point. And Samuel is feeding his papers to the fire. And John says sanely, "Don't you think you're maybe overreacting a little bit?" And Samuel says that he does not want any of their Confederates to suffer for his negligence. So he's covering the trail here. It's very important that this be a no fingerprints business. It's still, this is, pre-declaration, pre-end of war. This is still sedition and treason that they're talking. So yes, and then on another occasion, John Adams tells us, Samuel cuts his papers into little shreds with scissors and litters them out the window. So yes, those are scenes that, as I think I write, stop the biographer's heart, because exactly those are that was my material that just went out the window. Exactly.
So then could you talk a little bit about where else you went? You don't have you do have a lot of his writing, and we can talk about that in a little bit, all of his newspaper pieces under other names, but how did you document this? You have John Adams. Where else did you go?
So John Adams is definitely the most eloquent. I mean, I think anyone who's worked in the 18th century finds John Adams is sort of the Cicero of the 18th century. He takes over your narrative because he's so quotable. Samuel Adams's papers do exist. Obviously, there are holes in them, which, as we know, but there is an enormous collection of them at the New York Public Library. And what's beautiful about that collection is it's not only Adams' side of the correspondence, but the other side, the letters to him. So you get to see how his contemporaries feel about him, the respect with which he's addressed, who his closest intimates are. You get a sense of his domestic life. There's a great series of letters with his second wife, with whom he treats very much as an equal. There's a charming letter from another Samuel Adams who lives in Cape Cod and who writes to this Samuel Adams and basically says, "I'm so honored to share your name, but it is rather a dangerous name to bear." So you just get a sense of how he fits into the picture. So those letters are there, as are the records of the committees of correspondence, which is this kind of, we can talk about it, this kind of revolutionary network that Adams founds. And those documents are terrifically helpful. And then there's an enormous cache of material at the Massachusetts Historical Society, lots of diaries, a lot of ancillary letters. And then the other great trove is really what's in the British archives, because what is being written about Adams is almost more important than anything he's writing, because he's not sitting down and writing, I just participated in this boycott, or I just organized this destruction of tea in the harbor. But the Crown officials who are in Boston are all writing massive documents back to London to sort of talk about these mischief makers, and in particular this one ruffian who, if they could only get rid of, this entire business would just evaporate. There would be no more unrest. Everyone would go back to placid obedience.
And that's really interesting, because I wondered, it seemed like the British just consistently underestimated what was going on, or maybe they weren't paying attention just because there was no email and they were far away. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Why didn't they crack down sooner and arrest him? I mean, they were going to arrest him at the beginning of your book, and you should talk about that a little bit too, but they didn't.
I think both of those things are true, both the tone deafness and the ignorance. And the underestimating Adams is one of his greatest. I mean, he gets an enormous amount of mileage out of how much he is underestimated. He's really written off as this little desperado. The feeling is really, if only these couple of people can be silenced, all opposition will immediately cease, which is a complete miscalculation on the part of the British. Part of the answer to your question is just that London was a very great distance from Boston. Part of the problem is that the Crown officials on the ground really didn't take these people seriously, and in almost they're contemptuous. There's a condescension, really. There's a class difference almost that's at work. And the feeling is that these people are really acting out of kind of frustrated ambition as opposed to out of any kind of principles. It's really interesting. And even Thomas Hutchinson, who's American born, who will become kind of the greatest foil for Adams, who's the other lieutenant governor or governor for most of this period, doesn't really see that these new ideas are swelling up, and that Adams especially is able to sort of capture their, sort of pin them to the page and capture their logic. So it doesn't really sense what's happening in any palpable way. London seems to be dimly aware of where the colonies are. The geography is foggy even. It's unclear whether Philadelphia or New York is in the East or the West Indies. I mean, there's just this colossal ignorance of the American situation generally, and a certain disregard for the colonists who really are, as they surmise, seen as inferiors in many ways. And it's in part because of that condescension that you have this reaction on the part of the colonists. You had a second part of your question, but I now don't remember what it was.
I don't remember what it was. I think you probably answered it. I was just going to say, for people who have not yet read this book and who went to the same school I did where we didn't learn about Samuel Adams, could you just really briefly just synopsize your book in 2 sentences? Why was he so important? Why are we talking about him right now?
I guess what I would say is, I mean, John Adams puts it best when he says that the revolution took place long before anybody picked up a gun, that the 10 years prior to the revolution is the change in hearts and minds that is the real revolution. That's the real American Revolution. And for that, Samuel Adams is almost single-handedly responsible because he is the master communicator over those years. He's really able to, as I said, pull these ideas out of thin air and disseminate them in really original and effective ways. And he's pretty much he's running a sort of civil resistance operation, which operates almost according to modern principles, but obviously he's doing it very intuitively. So there are boycotts and there are pickets and there are extra legal assemblies, and there's a tremendous amount of pseudonymous propaganda in the press. And he's just really running circles around the sort of British officials for these 10 or 12 years in a dauntless, really resolute way. Nothing ever seems to dissuade him from his goal. And all that time recruiting the best and the brightest to join him in the revolutionary effort. I think I did that in 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. That was perfect. You say that he was you get a sense in this book that he's behind the scenes, he's maneuvering, he doesn't want to be out in front. You got John Hancock for that and others. You say he employed every dirty trick along the way. And as I'm reading it, he lied, he withheld crucial information. I'm guessing he believed the end justified the means, but there were also people in the book who said he was upstanding and he was principled and he was kind and he was generous. So I'm wondering, who was he? And do you feel like you got a sense of who he is as a human being?
I think that most of us, if we knew anything about Adams, and I too, who by the way grew up in Adams, Massachusetts, knew nothing about Samuel Adams. I think if we know anything, we think of him as like this hothead or, a kind of rabble rouser. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about the descriptions and what you see in the hands of his contemporaries is that he's always hailed as this very sweet, very affable, very decorous man of tremendous principle. But as John Adams puts it, of great erudition and exquisite humanity. There's an emphasis always on how genteel he is, how vaguely formal he is. So not at all this kind of ruffian of legend. But yes, as you say, every dirty trick. I mean, he will splice apart Thomas Hutchinson's letters and print them in the newspaper in a way that completely contorts Thomas Hutchinson's meaning, if that will help the cause. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that comes down to, indeed, the ends justifying the means. He's fighting for the rights of a people who he feels are not being heard by government. So are those tactics acceptable, or are those are those lowball tactics? And I guess I would say a lot of them are lowball tactics, which are performed in the service of a very high-minded ideal. And yes, he's a man of great contradiction, which is why I found him so compelling.
He was opposed to slavery and he was in favor of girls being educated. And I mean, I thought that was really fascinating too. I mean, he seemed to have a lot of sides and a real clear path, but he was also a terrible failure for the first 40 years of his life.
Yeah, and I don't know why I find that so endearing, but the fact that he amounts to nothing, he's this aimless, he can squander a fortune in seconds, and he's unable really to hold down a job. He's completely obsessed with politics. I mean, in a way, you could say you could argue that he is the first American politician because he doesn't have a profession, his sole profession. He devotes himself entirely to the public service, which he believes is what public servants should do. And he's very much dead set against people who somehow feel that their office entitles them to other benefits. He feels they should be there to serve their constituents. But because of that, he doesn't have time, or for that matter, the bandwidth for any kind of profession. He's really entirely involved in the dissemination of information, in changing minds, in really doing everything he can to make the communal voice heard. So yes, he inherits a great deal of money. He squanders it. He briefly holds a job in an accounting office. He loses it. He's actually fired outright. He takes a job probably for the income as a Boston town tax collector, and then runs up this enormous deficit, like 8 times more than any other Boston tax collector managed to do, and has to be bailed out by friends. One of those friends was probably John Hancock, and then really almost lives on thin air for much of the rest of his life, to the extent that when he prepares to go to the Continental Congress, someone clearly doesn't really want Massachusetts to be represented by so shabby a figure as poor impoverished Samuel Adams, and arranges in quick succession for a tailor and a wig maker and a shoemaker to stop at his house and to take his measure, and then several days later to deliver a fresh trunk of clothes for Samuel Adams so that he will appear among the eminent men in Philadelphia in a respectable fashion.
That is just a great story.
It does feel like a sort of fairy tale procession.
Just picture them all coming, bearing their.
Yes, and it's told by 2 different people in slightly different ways, but both of them with that sort of fairy tale component.
Could you talk a little bit about his other writing, not the journals and the things that he destroyed, but he wrote for newspaper after newspaper, and he wrote under all these different names, and he had different styles of writing for each persona. First of all, that's amazing. And second of all, how did you know they were him?
Such a great question. And also, don't you agree? I can only sound like myself. How he was able to sort of ventriloquize all of these other characters is astonishing. Yeah, right. The style of the day was to write under pseudonyms, so it wasn't particular to him. And I can't explain a lot of the pseudonyms, why he would write as a chatterer or a letter from the country or Vindex. very often these are classical allusions I can understand, but why he writes several pieces as Alfred, I cannot explain. So there are at least 30, and I'm sure there are more that we haven't yet detected pseudonyms. Many of them were identified by a grandson who wrote about him in the 19th century. So he published volumes of Samuel Adams's writing, and so Vindex and Candidus and some of the more popular or the longer running pseudonyms were identified by him. And then some of them we know because there is this just extraordinary hardware store owner in Boston who early in 1765, I'm so obsessed with this man, early in 1765 realizes that something is afoot, that history is about to be made, and begins to keep a collection of every week's newspapers in Boston. And this hardware store owner, who was something I think of an obsessive compulsive, also annotated those copies and wrote this kind of crazy quilt of an index to them. And he often identified Samuel Adams in his editions. So that was another way that it's easy to trace the pseudonyms, because Harbottle Door, as he was named, would often, and all of this, by the way, is online if anyone ever wants to look at it, because it's astonishing. He'll often write, my hero, or this is my creed. He'll often applaud or vilify someone in the margins of his copies. So that's a tremendous resource, and also gives us this really fresh sense of how just the man in the street was hearing and reading these pieces. And then in some cases, in some cases, Samuel Adams will recycle his own phrases. And so I picked up some new pseudonyms which got added to the mix, where he's used phrases that he writes in a personal letter, and then they reappear in a newspaper column. So it's pretty evident to me that those were Samuel Adams's as well.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Harbottle Door, because he was my favorite character in the entire book.
I think I would like to get a new cat just to name it Harbottle. Exactly.
this is your next book. I mean, he's just hardware store guy, and you describe him very beautifully in the book as, you know, a guy who, I forget what you said exactly, but it was very funny. He traffics in, you know, pickles and nails or something, but here he is, you know, keeping all of these newspapers. This is a man after my own heart, I have to say. But so
Nicholson Baker's heart too, exactly.
but those are all still around and they're annotated by him, and you had access to these?
Anyone can have access to them because they are brilliantly cataloged actually by the Massachusetts Historical Society. So if you just Google Harbottle Door and the Massachusetts Historical Society, you'll get the entire collection, and you'll see that there's just, I mean, the index goes on for ages. It's really, it's a little bit of a rabbit hole. I should probably warn everyone.
Sounds like a great rabbit hole. One thing also I wanted to ask you is, like, first of all, it's sort of ironic he was a tax collector, because taxes were the huge problem, you know, the Stamp Act and all of the other ones. But after the Stamp Acts were revoked, everything seemed to calm down for a couple of years, except for him. And he's like poking and prodding and doing his thing and writing. And he really is the one who kept things kind of stirred up and got them going again. Is that right?
He does that at two junctures, and you're absolutely right. He does that at two junctures, particularly everyone after the Stamp Act repeal feels now life can go back to normal, we're finished. But parliamentary sovereignty has still not been revoked. And that's sticking in Adams's craw. Everyone else is willing to let the Declaratory Act go. This idea that the sovereignty of Parliament is still being upheld. This is a question which is strangely ambiguous. There's no reference to Parliament in the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter. So no one had really ever resolved that question before. But Adams keeps the issue alive, and he'll do everything he can to keep it alive for the next few years, so that he's ready to pounce the next time there's a piece of legislation. So when the Townsend Acts are passed, he's ready to pounce. And he does it again after the Boston Massacre, another moment where after 1770, after the trials, everyone is just exhausted. They're exhausted by the street protests. They're exhausted by having to worry about being occupied. The soldiers are about to go home and then finally do leave. Everyone just wants life to go back to normal. And for those couple of years, Adams essentially relitigates the Boston Massacre trials. And he does that over a series of 6 months, mostly as Vindex on the front page of the Boston Gazette. So yes, at those two moments where everything has quieted, in the case of the post-Boston Massacre period, Thomas Hutchinson, who's then acting governor and ultimately governor, is actually sort of picking off Adams's colleagues and sort of bribing them to kind of come over to the right side and sort of detach themselves from Adams, and succeeds for the most part. And the cause is almost completely obliterated for those years. Adams alone is still sort of waving the flag. You asked me an excellent question, which I only just remembered. You asked why they didn't arrest him.
Yeah.
And you answer, and I'm sorry, I missed that one. He is the most wanted man in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in fact, there are many, many mentions of it's time to arrest him. It's time to send him back to Great Britain for trial. The problem is that it becomes too late to do so. That by the time General Gage arrives in Massachusetts with orders to do so, he realizes that to arrest Samuel Adams is to detonate a revolution. And so he's in this horrible position of having been told to do so in orders from London, but realizing that on the ground, it's a very fateful act to attempt.
Do you think, to go back to him stirring things up after everybody was sort of like, we're exhausted, this is good, we're not getting taxed, we don't have to use these stamps. Without him, would we still be British?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think one man is responsible for the American Revolution, but that it happens on the timetable it does, and in the manner it does, and with Massachusetts leading the way, I think we can pretty seriously say is the work of Samuel Adams. I mean, he does keep those issues at center stage. There's an interesting sort of contest by the time everyone gets to the Continental Congress between the Virginians and the New Englanders. And they're all of them on the same page. It's just that the New Englanders have been more obstreperous and more annoying about their insistence, but the Virginians are way out in front. Both colonies are way out in front of everyone else at that point. The Virginians have just done it with much more finesse than did the New Englanders.
Which is interesting, because I tell you, one thing that really surprised me when I was reading this book was how violent and destructive this was. And I mean, it's revolution. So that makes sense. But, this is not what I'm taught in grade school and in junior high, but ransacking houses and, breaking windows and threatening people and the street violence. And this was really eye-opening to me.
I think we all have a very sort of sanitized version of those years, more about Thomas Jefferson and the beauty of the words of the Declaration than we do about what actually preceded the first shots at Lexington and Concord. And it's throwing out those messy anarchic years that we throw out Samuel Adams and the rest of the sort of Massachusetts crew, because they do seem like hoodlums if you actually look at that way. And if you start to think about the destruction of the tea as a sort of lawless attack on personal property rather than a kind of noble affirmation of colonial rights, you see something very different.
So how does this fit, or does it not fit, with the people today who January 6th call themselves patriots, are violent and destructive, and would say that they identified with these people? I mean, were you thinking about this when you were working on the book?
Oh, yes, very much so. There's a really easy answer, which Adams himself provides, because he's alive when Shays' Rebellion happens.
Mhm.
So here he is, years after the revolution, there's suddenly this outbreak in Western Massachusetts. And it is immensely clear to him that this is precisely what one doesn't do with a legitimately elected government. If you have a problem with the legitimately elected government, you have an obvious means of recourse that's called an election. And he believed that the perpetrators of Shays' Rebellion actually should hang. He was very severe in his attitude toward them, whereas the unrest of the earlier years had been against an unresponsive government in which the colonists were not represented. So to have a government imposed upon you in which you did not participate was a very different thing in his mind from a government in which you were actually legally represented.
Which is also how he could be a tax collector for Massachusetts, but not leave the taxes that to pay to England.
It's not impossible he was elected a tax collector because everyone knew how indulgent a tax collector he would be. So there's also that possibility.
That's how incompetent he might be at this. Could you talk a little bit about his relationship with John Hancock? I thought was really fascinating. John Hancock is another one that I never knew very much about, except that he had the biggest signature, and so you kind of knew something about him from that. But he was very wealthy and he dressed, quite elaborately. And it sounded at the beginning of the book like Adams was able to sort of control him in a way, flatter him, or, give him what he wanted in order to keep him on his side. But then they had falling out. And I was just curious about their relationship and how that kind of progressed.
They're really sort of the odd couple of these years, or the odd couple of the American Revolution in many ways. Adams is 15 years older. He recruits John Hancock and is responsible for bringing him into the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He pretty much gambles that Hancock, who thrives on attention and applause and is very much interested in flattery, is going to love being the center of things. And that Hancock's fortune, because Hancock has one of the greatest fortunes in New England, which he inherits from an uncle, that Hancock's fortune will be very useful to the opposition party. So he thinks this will work both ways. And he's quite right about that. To the eyes of people who didn't like him, John Hancock was often written down as a, and I'm quoting, a contemptible fool led about by Samuel Adams. And there was really a feeling that Hancock was doing what Adams suggested he do. But Hancock had a mind of his own, and at several junctures will disassociate himself from Adams. He'll at one point in particular, he'll say he never intends to speak to Adams and hopes never to see him again. And that's in that sort of that 1770 to 1773 quiet period when that will happen. They're complete opposites in that Hancock is he's deeply philanthropic. He's very generous with the town of Boston, but he's really invested in what people think and in being thanked for what he's done and in being paid attention to. Whereas Adams is this very recessive, as I said, very modest, sort of demure character in many ways. And he's always eager to push somebody else toward the spotlight. So it's this very uncomfortable relationship much of the time. They work very closely together, and then they can be at sort of antipodes at other times. It's a very troubled relationship. Ultimately, they will fall out at Congress. Hancock will come back to Massachusetts and really badmouth Adams and quite seriously criticize Adams in a way that also explains why we don't know Adams as well today, because Hancock takes a sort of a bite out of his reputation in those years. And only at the very end of Hancock's life, although he's younger, he dies first, will the two of them reconcile. So it's a very on again, off again affair where they are sometimes united in the political cause, and sometimes, it seems anyway, at each other's throats.
Yeah, there was another really interesting relationship in the book. Otis, is it James Otis? Is that his name? Who seemed like he was quite useful and quite brilliant, and then he got beat up in this. I forget what the altercation was, but it seemed like he was never the same after that. Could you talk a little bit about him and his relationship with Adams? Because Adams then was sort of taking care of him after that in a way, not his caretaker physically, but kind of helping him continue to be part of the revolution.
James Otis, like insofar as Adams had a mentor, it would have been James Otis, although Otis is actually a few years younger than Adams. But Otis is generally recognized in the 1760s as the most brilliant, most erudite lawyer on the rise in New England. And he's a pyrotechnic speaker. He's just, incredibly compelling, quite really dazzling. And clearly has a bit of some kind of mania early on. And then, yes, after he is in a barroom scuffle because of an altercation over something that someone publishes about him, he's entirely unbalanced. So that it's very difficult for Adams, because who's immensely loyal as a person generally, but particularly loyal to Otis, because Otis will kind of have Whig days and Tory days, days where he thinks the Stamp Act was a terrible idea, and days where he thinks that maybe the Stamp Act should be put back into effect. Days where he arrives on Thomas Hutchinson's doorstep smelling of liquor, days where he fires guns out his windows, and he's just completely unpredictable. And Adams is, as we see from some of his letters, writing mutual friends saying, can you help me here? Basically be gentle, folding Otis into committees where Otis will do no harm, essentially, making him feel as if he's still part of this party to which he belongs, but not allowing him really to sort of have his hands on the controls in any way. And it's it's clearly some sort of bipolar disorder, obviously not diagnosed, but it's really disheartening. And it's something where you can hear Adams is writing someone at one point, he basically is saying, there are tears in my eyes as I say this.
It just seemed like such a kindness, not manipulative. He was manipulative in other ways for other reasons, but this just seemed like an enormous kindness. I also wondered did you have any sense of when Adams kind of had that pivot to, we need independence, we need to break? Because it didn't seem like that was really his goal in the beginning.
So the problem with independence, the word independence, is that it was a word no one could really speak aloud. And even if you look at, I think I looked at all of the most prominent founders' letters, everyone backs away from that word really until the final minute, because it really is it's the last resort, and nobody wants to go near it because it's the third rail. It's just too dangerous a concept even really to consider. Most everyone else will identify a Rubicon in his or her thinking. Very often that Rubicon in the thinking is 1768, when for the first time British troops march into Boston to occupy the town, because the town has been so incredibly ill-behaved and so obstreperous. And the general wisdom has been that is when Samuel Adams too crosses the Rubicon and determines that independence is necessary. The only problem is that there is actually nothing on paper that indicates that he came to that decision at that particular moment. So I'm quite skeptical that that's actually what decides him then. He actually, unlike everyone else, never crosses a Rubicon, or at least on paper. He does seem for those years really to be intent on redress rather than on any kind of revolution. He really just wants the relationship put back as it was. He wants the older Massachusetts charter to be reinstated. He wants the question of parliamentary sovereignty to be determined. He wants basically the colonies to be in charge of themselves. And how that ultimately grows to, we need a rupture with the mother country, I think happens later than 1768. I think happens well after the Boston Massacre, in fact. But he doesn't leave us a determining line when he comes to that decision. He does say the morning after Lexington and Concord, a night that he and John Hancock have spent cowering in the
Right.
wilds, basically, that he feels that independence should have been declared that day. So the next year is a torture for him because it takes so long to get from Lexington and Concord to the Declaration. But until that point, it's not a word that he toys with ever.
So not even in all of those newspaper articles under various names, he does not go that far.
He meant, as far as I remember, he mentions independence only ever when he says this is a concept from which Great Britain should shrink. In other words, it's something that great, and as what you hinted at earlier, it's Great Britain is inadvertently pushing us to independence. It's not something for which we are necessarily ourselves hungering. And in a way, he's right, because this is so much a history of unforced error between the Stamp Act and the Declaration. So much of these are just British oversteps and as we said, tone deafness, rather than any active campaign on the colony's part.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you wrote the book. And before I get into that, I just have to say, you have such delightful turns of phrase, just delightful writing. And you have these sort of modern day references that you put in here, just not a lot, but enough to keep it lively. So for instance, when Adams gets a flannel outfit to make horseback riding less painful, you call it an early American version of biking shorts, which made me laugh out loud. And this one, I did not write down the exact quote, but it's in the very beginning of the book, and you're talking about how he kind of slips in and slips out of things, and he's, kind of behind the scenes, and you compare him to a comic book superhero emerging from a phone booth. And I wanted to know, are these things that just sort of come to you as you're writing and because you have such a quick and witty mind, or do you think, okay, now I need something here that's going to grab people, and so you have to stop and think, how can you compare it? How do you do that?
I'd love to claim credit for the quick and witty mind, but that's unfortunately a non-starter. No, they come to you on the page as you're working. I mean, every once in a while, I tend to keep a notebook. I don't know if you do this too, of just sort of themes I mean to explore in the book, or occasionally a phrase I know falls in, or a description of something, which I think of as kind of the stem cells of the book. And every once in a while, something will turn up there that I then end up using, but that's fairly rare. It's usually when you're writing and you just realize you've just sort of in a loose way described something that has a modern analogy. I will admit to you that the biking shorts I was a little uncertain about, and I think I took out and then put in and took out and put in again, because it was just a little bit too, it was just a little bit too cute for me for a while. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Now you've just vindicated me.
It actually helped me picture what these things look like.
Well, it was exactly.
I'm not sure what they did with the flannel,
That also is from John Adams's diary, which is, yet again, proof that the most eloquent person wins, right? Because so much of this comes from John Adams, who's just writing everything down.
So this was a 5-year project, is that right? It started in 20.
I don't seem to be able to write a book in fewer than 5 years. I think this was a little longer. How do we count COVID years? It felt like they were 5 years long, right? Yeah. So yes, it was 5 or 5.5 years all in.
So I don't know if you can even answer this, but I'm just, how do you organize such a massive amount of material? I'm picturing little note cards all over your office floor, but that might not be the way you do it. How do you do it?
That's pretty close, and that would perhaps be more effective than the way I do it. I'm absurdly and very inefficiently paper oriented. Mm-hmm. So I tend to print things out. So if I go into an archive, for example, and my day of notes is not on note cards, but I will ultimately print out the, whatever June in the Massachusetts Historical Society will be a printed out file of some kind. And then I keep files of each sort of category of things. So there would be a file on the Stamp Act. There would be a file on Adams's health. There would be a file on his domestic life. There would be a file on his tax collecting. There'd be a file for a particular year if it were particularly crucial. There'd be a file on the Boston Massacre. And then I tend to read through all of that material several times, even if it's not pertinent to that part of the book I'm working on, because there often is some kind of resonance that you don't pick up on until you're sort of putting the whole thing together. So all of those things are filed, and then there are computer files, which are all printed. And then I stupidly and slavishly go through all of it and put together what I think of as kind of an text for every section of the book as I'm working. So, from 1760 to 1764 might be its own text, which is the lead up to the Stamp Act. And I go through all of those files and pull out, sort of cut and paste everything I want into a single document. And it's from that document that I then write a chapter or 2 chapters or 3 chapters. So I've just described the world's least efficient system for writing a book. And I look forward to someone telling me how to properly do it.
I think that's better than note cards on the floor. But when I talked to you a long time ago, 10 years ago, when Cleopatra came out in paperback, you told me then that you write in longhand. Do you still do that?
I do. I write in longhand, in longhand with a mechanical pencil on a legal pad, and I can't do it any other way. And I think most of it is, some of it may be superstition. This is how I've always written a book, so this is how I will do it again this time. But I'm a very fast typist and I'm not a fast thinker. And I feel like the thoughts and the fingers are going at different speeds.
Mm.
And I just find that first of all, there's almost a satisfaction of the lead moving across the page. It's also labor and it slows me down. And something about the fact that there is that little bit of resistance, I think makes me, it's centering in some way. And it means that the thoughts and the words align, or so I seem to think, better than they would if I were actually typing on a keyboard.
Mhm.
And I also think I write more concisely. And I think we all write longer because it's so much easier to type. So I feel like it is also a somewhat helpful act in terms of just compressing material if I'm forcing myself to write it out by hand. But I'm not a complete Luddite. Then I type it into the computer and then, a lot happens on the screen and then with printed out pages. But yes, every first draft is always on a legal pad.
Do you have someone help you fact check?
I've hired fact checkers for the last 3 books.
Okay.
Absolutely, because the publisher doesn't do it. And it's astonishing, especially if you're taking notes in an archive and you're, writing down what you think is a quotation that you think you're going to use from, let's say, a letter of Thomas Hutchinson's, which is nowhere published. It's amazing how many errors will creep into your transcription, which you weren't necessarily sure you were going to use, and then you do end up using. So it's very helpful to have someone go back and check all of those things. Yeah.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I really enjoyed reading the book, but I think that audience members have questions now. So I will disappear and Rob Gowdy will show up and he will monitor those questions. So
All right,
Rob,
thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Right,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the screen, Lori, and for what a fascinating conversation between you and Stacy. Thank you so much, Stacy.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I met Stacy before the program. You're meeting me for the first time tonight. I'm Rob Gowdy. I'm the events director for Friends of the Hennepin County Library, and it's my pleasure to join the program to moderate your questions for Stacy. So just as a reminder as we get started, if you would like to ask Stacy a question, please click the Q&A icon on the bottom center of the screen. So are you ready for some audience questions?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. This first question is from Carol. This is your 3rd book on early American history after A Great Improvisation and The Witches' Salem 1692. What brings you back again and again to these eras of our country's past?
What a great question. I actually kind of thought that, in some way, I don't mean to sound, I don't mean to make too much of this, but I felt as if there was a missing link between the book on witchcraft and the Franklin book. And my question was, how did we get from these benighted, 17th century New England villagers to the Enlightenment figures, which were Franklin and Jefferson? And this was the middle piece. This was the missing link. Some people have referred to Samuel Adams as the last of the Puritans. So it was almost this attempt to sort of attach the 2 books to each other in some way. But I do think there is just something. A biographer friend of mine who lives in Boston accuses me of secretly wanting to move back to Massachusetts, where I am from, because I keep going back there in the work. And I do think there is something there, but also just that New England is so fundamental to so much of what happens in this country later, that I just think it's an immensely rich piece of territory. And the cast of characters has become very real to me and very present to me. And I think it's a great comfort in some ways to go back to them. I was spending a lot of time with Franklin after 2016, and that was how I re-met Samuel Adams.
So, and how did you hone in on Adams as being the one you wanted to link those two books with?
So Adams is the one whom everyone else, all of his contemporaries say about Samuel Adams that he is the father of the revolution. And Thomas Jefferson is the person who calls him the earliest, the most active, and the most persevering man of the revolution. And then late in his life, for Jefferson's first inaugural address, he writes to Adams and says, when I was composing that address, you don't know this, but I was actually writing to you. And it's a personal letter to you. And he thinks of Adams as sort of the avatar, the embodiment of republicanism. He's the apostle of liberty in Jefferson's mind. And I just kept looking at these things thinking, how is it possible that his contemporaries treat him with such respect and call out his and underline his importance, and yet we know so little about him? And that was what led me down that road.
I think this next question dovetails with this nicely. This is from Jan. What initiates and feeds Samuel Adams' character? Who, what influenced him in his formative years regarding his principles? That's
so great. In large part, he is devoutly religious. So all Puritan principles apply. And the idea that, you should have a church without any kind of hierarchy, and you should have a republic without any kind of king is very much central to his thinking. His father clearly had his own brushes with authority and didn't shy from those brushes. So my sense from it's very shadowy, the little we know about the father is that Adams was taught early on to speak up for himself, to ask questions, to confront authority, to call out when he thought things were not righteously adjudicated. And then there's a single event which I treat at some length in the book, and I'll do very briefly right now. Adams's father is ruined by an act of Parliament. Adams's father becomes a director of a banking venture in the early 1740s, which is entirely legal, but which is shut down peremptorily by Parliament. And in doing so, Adams is ruined. Samuel Adams Sr. is ruined. And our Samuel Adams, will spend years fighting off sheriffs and having to deal with the debt that has left him because of his father's banking venture. And there is definitely something, I think, about that initial clash with parliamentary overreach that will color the years that follow. So I think that the land bank fiasco has something to do with who he's going to become, but he's really applying his very staunch and devoutly held religious beliefs to what happens afterward as well.
Since we're on Samuel's character, I think this next question from Natalie would be a good one to ask. Two questions. One, how did Samuel Adams react to John's defense of the Boston Massacre soldiers? And oh, I'm sorry, I just lost that one. Where's number two? Number two, less seriously, what about the beer? So how did Samuel Adams react to John's defense of the Boston Massacre? And less seriously, what about the beer?
So the massacre defense is fascinating. Those months, John Adams, just to go back half a step, John Adams defends the soldiers of the Boston Massacre trials. He could not have done so without Samuel Adams having signed off on that idea. And we know this because Samuel Adams did sign off on Josiah Quincy, who works with John Adams, is serving as the defense. The conversations between the two cousins over those months must have been fascinating. They are entirely lost to us. The feeling generally is that Samuel would have been happy for John to be the one trying this case, because he could kind of keep Boston's secret and he could let out what needed to be let out. And it was very important to everyone that justice be served. As John Adams will say later, it was perfectly possible that the soldiers were murdered, that innocents were slain, and that the soldiers were themselves, that there was guilt all around, essentially. John Adams Samuel will try to twist John Adams's arm into his delivering a massacre oration several years later, which was a very shrewd idea, to have this person who had defended the soldiers delivering an oration about the horrors of that day, about the martyrdom of Boston civilians at the hands of British redcoats. And John will weasel out of it. It's a really interesting kind of, you see the two of them kind of arm wrestling with each other a little bit, but he never says, there's any difference of opinion between the two of them. So there was clearly a certain amount of coordination between the two. And as I said, it doesn't stop Samuel for 6 months afterwards, relitigating the case that John has so brilliantly tried. As for the beer, I did an event in Boston 2 nights ago with the Sam Adams beer people. I mean, you don't often get to do that as a biographer, you know, you don't usually do events with beer people. And yes, we had a great laugh over who has done more to put Samuel Adams on the map. Because literally, if you Google Sam Adams, you don't find out anything about the life, you find out about the beer.
Thank you for those fascinating answers. And we're going to move a little bit into more of your writing process and research process. This is from Linda. Can you tell us more about your research process? Is there a time when you slow down the research and ramp up the writing? And when do you know it's time to start writing?
Oh, Linda, that's the other great question. You know when it's time to start writing when you look at the calendar and you realize that your publisher is calling you regularly. It tends to break down always around the same kind of milestones. I research first. I can't even begin to imagine writing a book without having done the bulk of the research. And I know this is very much different from the way many other writers of nonfiction work, but I just don't know the shape of the book. I don't know the shape of the chapters. I don't know the themes of the book. I don't know where I'm going to want to start until I've done the bulk of the research. So I usually spend about 3 or 3.5 years really just researching. And it can be dreary. It's like endlessly grocery shopping for the meal you're never going to make. I mean, you're just constantly bringing things home and they're just sort of sitting there. And then at a certain point, they start to simmer, or sentences begin to kind of rise to the surface, and you begin to sort of see that something is fermenting, or you hope it is anyway. And usually by then it is around that period that I just mentioned, where you realize you have 1.5 years to go before a deadline, and if you don't start writing, it's really not going to happen. And sometimes you have to be pulled almost bodily out of the archives, because I do find it's easier to research anything's easier to do than to write, but researching, which I find a great pleasure, is really easier to do than it is to write. So usually about the 3.5 year mark, I start writing. And then I don't really want to leave my desk, but every once in a while you turn a corner and realize that you forgot to research something, or there's an archive that wasn't open that's now open, or a new cache of papers appears, and you do have to go back into the archives. But usually I spend about 1.5 years just insofar as I can exclusively writing.
And since you mentioned the archives, this next question from Judith is a great one. Can you please discuss your sources? Which archives, libraries, et cetera, did you use for your primary sources? And I know you've mentioned the Massachusetts Historical Society and the British Archives. Can you just flesh that out a little bit more for us?
Sure. The papers of Samuel Adams himself are at the New York Public Library. And that's also, as I said, where the Committee of Correspondence things are. The newspaper collections, I mean, I read through the Boston Gazettes for almost all of these years, partly because of Adams's work, but also because I wanted to know, what did the town smell like? What did it sound like? What were people preoccupied by? What were they selling? What were they buying? What were the prices like? And that run of newspapers was in the Massachusetts Historical Society, which also has a great number of diaries from this period, some other ancillary correspondences, letters being written about Samuel Adams, which of course are very interesting, not to him or from him, but what other people are saying, which you really do want to know. And then the letters of Thomas Hutchinson and the letters of Francis Bernard, the 2 royal governors for this period, are immensely helpful. And both of them had just been published in beautifully annotated editions by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. So that was an enormous resource. And then in the UK, really there are 2 places, the Parliamentary Archives and the National Archives at Kew. And in particular, the National Archives has every scrap of paper that was sent back to Great Britain in these years. I mean, even things like after the Boston Tea Party, no one in Boston had seen a thing. No one in Boston would name a name, but 12 men are deposed several weeks later in London, and they will talk about who were the most active people at the tea meetings were, how Samuel Adams was largely directing these meetings, who was doing what. And so that material is in the British archives. So a lot of this was researched in London.
I have a wonderful next question that is, I think needs a little bit of context. We've had an embarrassment of riches in terms of historians visiting the Twin Cities over the last week. We ourselves hosted Annette Gordon-Reed, and the University of Minnesota just hosted Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 project founder. So I think this is where this question comes from. Linda asks, what are your thoughts about the balance and accuracy of the recent book 1619?
You know, this is an embarrassment. I haven't read much of it except what's been in the press because I've been trying to turn out this book on Samuel Adams, nor have I seen most of the movies of the last 5 years. So it's a really hard one for me to answer.
Okay, we'll just skip over that one then and go into, this is a wonderful one from Beverly. Did writing biography find you or did you find it?
Huh. I left publishing where I was working to write my first book. And I think I was comforted by the idea of writing biography because biography seemed manageable in some way. It's got an obvious beginning, a middle, and an end. For the most part, usually you're working chronologically, telling a history through a life or through a sensibility. It has a built-in structure in many ways. So I think that I felt confident enough as a young writer to attempt a biography. I had edited a number of biographies and I liked the form and I loved reading them. I had read those little red, white, and blue, Susan B. Anthony type books that we had when we were all kids. So to a great extent, I thought, well, this is a book I can probably attempt and maybe not make a complete botch of. And then having written one biography, I was astounded to discover that people think of you as a biographer, and that I actually really enjoyed the sort of somehow having to tell an entire chapter of history through a life or through several lives. And after that first book, decided simply that I wanted to write another book, but that I wanted to write something that was a somewhat more complicated book or a more sophisticated book. And that's when I did a book about a couple, because I felt that it would be more interesting to try to write a dual biography than to write about a single life. But still, there was this attraction to both the personal and to the archival richness which tend to gather around lives. And that sort of challenge of, can you stay close to your subject's shoulder and still tell a bigger story? And then I've played with it in certain ways. I mean, the Franklin book is really meant to be a biography of Ben Franklin, but told only through the 8.5 years that he spends in France. So the question there was, can you tell an entire life through its one greatest chapter?
Wow, just stunning. I think we have time for one more question, but before we do, I just want to remind everyone that if you have not gotten your copy of the Revolutionary Samuel Adams yet, look at this face. You absolutely have to. And we're dropping a link in the chat to make your purchase through our local bookselling partner, Majors & Quinn. If you don't want it, maybe you could get it for your aunt or your dad or your college student.
Or your
Yeah, because you know what? It's December and gosh darn it, it's gift giving season. So I know that there's someone in your life who needs a copy of The Revolutionary. And from the minute you start reading about Paul Revere's ride at the beginning of this book, it will take you on a journey that will never stop. So please purchase a copy of the book, do it through Majors & Quinn. When you do so, you are helping our local literary community to thrive. And with that, our final question. This is from Gail. What writers inspire you as a writer, and what writers do you love to read?
Oh, Gail, my goodness, how many more minutes do we have? I would say that I read a lot. I read mostly fiction if I'm left to my own devices. I think I probably read, when I was trying to figure out how to write biography, I read a lot of biography. I think now always I turn to fiction. Hilary Mantel would probably be the top of the pile, right? I mean, every single book of Hilary Mantel's is a gift in every possible way. Even the books I don't love to death, I read and reread. I read a lot of Nancy Mitford when I was a young biographer trying to figure out how to write biography. I read a lot of Leon Adele when I was just starting out. But now it's really, I mean, I could subsist on a steady diet of, modern fiction and Trollope and Balzac. And and memoir, I should say. I'm reading the Daryl Pinckney memoir right now. I'll read a memoir on any subject at any time of the night or day. But I think I've got to the point where the beauty of the prose is really as important to me as anything else. And for that, I really do turn to fiction.
Well, with that wonderful, generous answer, who gave us so many new people to read, we bring our program to a close. Stacy, it has been an utter delight having you tonight. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all for joining us.
Yes, and thanks also to Lori Herzl for guiding that wonderful conversation earlier this evening. And as we wrap up, I have one final reminder before you log off. If you enjoyed tonight's program and you'd like to help us reach our goal of placing 15,000 books on library shelves by December 31st, please click the link in the chat to donate. So there's a link to the donate button. There's a link to get your copy of the Revolutionary Samuel Adams for your favorite loved one this holiday. Thank you so much for joining us, and from all of us at Friends, a very happy holiday season to you all, and have a great night.